Banks don't make loans for production. They don't make loans to build factories. They make loans to corporate raiders to take over factories, fire the workers, downsize, and squeeze it out, smash up the company, and to sell off the company's real estate for amount of money, agree on a lease back, and pay the sales price to the financial backers as a special dividend. The attempt to make an idea of how the economy works without realizing that it's the bankers that do the planning, it's the bankers that create the money, the bankers that create the economic surplus, then you're just going to somehow imagine that capitalism itself creates this money to monopolize. And if capitalism didn't do that, it was the financial class independently of capitalism that created this money to take over the industry, to take over the means of production, and then just smash it up for themselves. I think the group today is probably the first Marxist group I've spoken to in the last 30 years. I don't know any Marxist who's interested in finance at all. I sat down with Richard Wolff, and we had a 4-hour discussion with Robinson Earhart on the evolution of Marxism and how was it that Marxists have turned so anti-Marxism. What makes Marxism Marxists hate Volume 2 so much, hate Volume 3 so much? Why do they not understand the role of banking? There's I think personalities of very ignorant people that such as you're describing, who have this tunnel vision that is they've been suckered by the banking class and the lobbyists. So I don't think they're Marxists. Most people that claim to be Marxists aren't. And I must say, I've had the same problem in China, that there cannot be any progress made in American politics without getting rid of the Democratic Party, period. Awful as it may seem to get the Democrats out of power, even at the cost of turning it over to Trump and the Republicans, who will certainly self-destruct the economy very quickly. Their job is to protect the Republicans and the vested interests from any critique from the left. And you want to take away the ability of that pretense that the Democrats represent the left. So Jill and I have both said one of our aims, we know that she's not going to be elected president, but we can make sure that the Democratic Party will not get the presidency and can never get the presidency again, because we're going to make it very clear to the voters how it's necessary to destroy the Democratic Party and the Democratic Leadership Committee and the whole rotten structure of it in order for them to be any free electoral progress in the United States.
Another Class Unity Speaker Series event. Class Unity is a Marxist organization that supports class struggle politics here in the United States. We believe in class politics, not identity politics. Our ultimate aim is to help build a coalition that would establish a workers' party here in the United States. If you would like to support us, please consider giving us a donation, or even better, by joining us. You can do either by going to our website, classunity.org. In addition, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share with your friends. Our political education program is concerned with promoting materialist analysis on politics, economics, and social issues. Part of that program is our speaker series. And for our main event today, we'll be speaking to Professor Michael Hudson. Professor Michael Hudson is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends and a distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He has written a great number of books on economics, trade, imperialism, finance capitalism, and debt. Today's event is about his book, Killing the Host: How Financial Parasites and Debt Bondage Destroy the Global Economy. Professor, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. We read your book as part of a reading group we had on the 2008 financial crisis. And we're all well aware that you were one of the few economists who correctly predicted the global financial crisis before it happened. So could you tell us about that? How were you able to predict it when it seemed like no one else could? And what prompted you to write that book?
Well, it was fairly easy to predict because the basic assumption of my book is very simple. The rate of interest grows exponentially. Any rate of interest is a doubling time. And I described the rule of 72 there. Any sum at any rate of interest doubles and redoubles and redoubles in an exponential curve. But the economy only grows in an S curve. All of this was, I was happy to find, was discovered in Mesopotamia. Already in 1800 BC, we have the training groups that scribes were taught mathematically. And the mathematical models that the Babylonians had are far superior, more sophisticated than any model put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research or the other official agencies, precisely because students were told, on the one hand, to calculate how long does it take a mina of a sum of loan of silver to double? Well, at 20% per year, or rather at 1/60th per month. Well, 1/60th in 60 months means it takes 60 months or 5 years to double. How much to quadruple? Well, that's another 5 years. That's 10 years. How much to multiply 8 times? Well, yet that's another 5 years, and so on. So by the end of 30 years, you have the sum of interest multiplying 64 times. Well, there wasn't any compound interest permitted in Babylonia. Every time that there was a doubling of the original sum, a new contract had to be made. But if you were a wealthy person and you had money lending out, the credits that other people would owe you would be going up in that curve that I mentioned. Already at that time, in 1800 BC, we also have analyses of mathematical models of how rapidly a herd of cattle grow, and they grow in an S curve. Well, today it's pretty much the same thing, except the reason that the US and other economies taper off is because the debt burden gets higher and higher and higher, shrinking the domestic economy, shrinking consumption, shrinking investment, and the result is that at a point, the debts can't be paid. And you could say that that's the underlying principle of my book. A debt that can't be paid won't be. But the question is, how won't the debts be paid? And ever since Greece and Rome, classical antiquity, you had the distinguishing feature of Western civilization is pro-creditor laws. Instead of wiping out the debts and canceling them, you said, well, if a debtor can't pay, they lose the land, they lose their freedom, they become bond servants, and the economy polarizes and then collapses, is what happens in Rome. Well, you can understand why the National Bureau of Economic Research and no economic courses teach that obvious principle, because if an economic curriculum dealt with debt and the tendency to debt to grow faster than the economy can grow, then there's going to be a crash. Well, all of the National Bureau of Economic Research models assume a constant S-curve, that everything will be self-correcting, that there are no financial problems in the economy because somehow the magic of the marketplace is going to make everybody able to pay their debts, as long as you're willing to see 90% of the population lose all their property, have their income go down, and 10%, then 1% of the population ending up with everything. Well, I would not be able to fit into the economics curriculum any of the history of debt and how societies have crashed again and again and again, because that would go against all of the idea of self-correcting economies. And why would the economics discipline and the government's official economic agency, the National Bureau of Economic Research, have such an unrealistic model? Well, the reason is because the financial class doesn't want a model that shows that their activities are unproductive and corrosive and lead to an economic collapse. And yet that's the lesson of history. And if you, I've just been working on a history of debts and the banking and creditor system, political alliances from the Crusades up to World War I, the whole history. If you're looking at the 17th century, the 18th century, there were all sorts of discussions about the dynamics of debt, who benefits, what if the debt is owed to foreigners. None of this discussion is permitted into the curriculum, which is why I was a professor at the University of the Kansas City at Missouri. That was the only university in the country that taught modern monetary theory, whose essence was you don't have to borrow from the wealthy financiers and creditors to finance the budget deficit. Governments can create their own credit, and the effect is identical from between a government printing money and a government having to borrow money from the wealthy class that wouldn't spend this money on consumer goods in any case. So basically, I found that the curriculum in most universities was just economic fiction. All of this is discussed by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital. I've been disappointed to find that most people who've called themselves Marxists have not read Volume 3. They're sort of Volume 1 Marxists. They think that the idea of Marxism is simply the exploitation of wage labor by employers that sell labor for a price markup. But Marx said this is only part of the economy. The rest of the economy is what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo and everybody else of the 19th century was really talking about. How do we get rid of the legacy of feudalism, the landlord class? How do we get rid of the power of the House of Lords that's run by the landlord class so that workers don't have to pay high rents anymore? And as an extension of that, how do we get rid of the monopolies that governments created in order to be able to borrow money from bankers, all to go to war? Until the until the 18th century, all government debt was borrowed for only one purpose: to go to war. And that was not a productive use of debt. And as a result, the kingdoms began to go broke again and again and again, especially the leading military kingdoms, Spain, France, and later the Habsburg Austria. So you had the sort of fight between what became the Catholic countries back being autocracies that wanted to prevent parliamentary government. And you had all of a sudden the banking class discover around the 17th century, we can't find a good market for our war loans anymore because kings can't pay. We need to create a state that is basically structured so that parliaments can no longer block a king from paying debts. The whole state has to be constructed to act as our financial agent to be able to tax the entire economy to finance the growing debt. And that basically is the modern fiscal state that's existed since 1700. I don't get into this history and killing the the host. But what I do get into is how the result of that is that since finance is just as predatory a form of economic rent as land rent was in the 19th century, it wants to make itself invisible. And the way it makes itself invisible is to say, well, bankers and creditors are playing a financial role. Well, by the late 19th century, there was a growing political movement, and it was basically a liberal movement, including Marx. Marx, in many ways, was a free marketer in the sense that he said, if dialectical materialism works, and if countries act in their self-interest, if the industrial class acts as its self-interest, it's not only going to get rid of landlords, it's going to get rid of predatory banking. It's going to industrialize banking. And the result is that the landlord class that was threatened, the monopoly class, and the bankers all get together, and they fought against this whole development of value, price, and rent theory that was the key to classical political economy in the 19th century. And by the time they began to really fight against this in the 1890s, early to 1900s, the Marxism had absorbed most of the classical economics of Smith, Mill, and the others. And so the fight against Marxism was really a whole fight against the value system and the value theory and the idea that economic rent is the excess of market price over value. And that rent is unearned, it's exploitative. And Marx said capitalism is revolutionary because its destiny is to free economies from economic rent, the end of feudalism, and to transform itself into socialism. Well, that's what pretty much I was taught growing up. And even when I took my PhD at New York University in the 1960s, there was still a history of economic thought. And there was an economic history course. There is no longer these two histories in the graduate economics curriculum. It's been replaced by mathematics, and the result is when people in the press, the media, talk about economic growth, they're talking about GDP. But the problem of GDP is it's a product of this whole reaction against Marxism and against classical economics. And this was all mounted basically as I describe in the book, by J.B. Clark in America in the 1890s and the Austrian school at the same time. Well, look at today's, what Marx pointed out is economies are bisected into two parts. There's the production economy, production and consumption, and the marketing, the distribution. That's the sort of productive part of the economy. But Marx's volumes 2 and 3 said there's also the circulation department. Circulation is the banking, the monopolies, the price system that has nothing to do with production at all. Well, this discussion of volume 3 is exactly why the financial classes and the landlords all said, we've got to get rid not only of Marxism, but against the whole idea of classical economics behind it, that not all income is earned, that not all wealth is earned, that some income and wealth are earned by purely predatory means. And the new idea was that that everybody deserves whatever they get. Well, suppose you were trying to make a Marxist analysis of today's American economy. You would look at the GDP and you'd say much of that GDP is not really for national income and product accounts. Most of this GDP is not a product at all. Interest is not a product. It's an overhead charge. And I think I mentioned that if a bank's credit card company charges penalty rates, that double the interest rate, or raise the interest rate from 19% now to 33%, that penalty rate is called in the GDP accounts providing economic services. So the financial sector, the landlord sector, the real estate sector, the monopoly sector of insurance, public health, wants to depict itself as being a necessary part of the economy, not a part of the economy to get rid of. And if you're brainwashed into going through an economics PhD, being taught all of this, it doesn't occur to you that some parts of the economy not only don't you need, but they're actually predatory. And as these parts of the economy grow, the rentier parts, landlords, bankers, and monopolists, then what they take is going to shrink the economy more and more and deindustrialize it. And that's why America's deindustrialized today. So as I talk about in the very introduction to Killing the Host, the idea of a parasite is to pretend that it's part of the host, that the host needs it. And a smart parasite will keep the host just alive enough to keep feeding it. But finance capitalism has pretty much replaced industrial capitalism, and that's not a smart parasite. It's killing the economy. It began under the Clinton in the 1990s. The Democratic Party's program is basically one of deindustrialization, thinking that, well, you're making wealth quicker. Well, the wealth that America's been making, certainly since 2008, as I described, is almost all accrued to the upper 5 or even 1%, while the 99% have gone down and down and down in terms of what their wages and living standards will do. Not only in terms of buying groceries and goods and services in the consumer price index, but of buying access to housing. So what you've had since Clinton started the big foreclosure on the non-whites of the economy, the blacks and the Hispanics that were victims of the junk mortgage loans. Since he proceeded to evict them all, you've had home ownership in America dropping very sharply, most of all among the black and Hispanic populations. And yet they've been applauding still Obama to the point that he's now going to Pennsylvania, I think yesterday, with Harris to tell people to vote Democratic instead of being looked at as a poison, having poisoned the economy by basically putting the financial racketeers in charge and not throwing them in jail.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to touch on that last point about the Democratic Party at some point in our discussion. It looks like we have a few questions here already. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can type your place in line in the chat. We can start with Martin. Go ahead.
Sorry. Hi. Sorry. Now I can't see Michael. Sorry. One sec. There we go.
I can see you.
Yes, thanks very much for meeting with us, and lots of fascinating, enlightening stuff in the book. And the question I had, I think some of what you were saying just now touched on it. I'll try to ask it as concisely as I can.
But talk slow a little. Don't talk too fast.
Okay, sorry. So obviously the book is calling for a sort of a push back against the financialization of the economy, right? Reforms to
back. I mean, that really the only solution to debts growing exponentially is to cancel the debts. Especially, you can see that for student debt. You can see that for third world debt. As I said, the debts have gone beyond their ability to be paid without stifling the economy. At that point, the debts have to be canceled. That's not pushing back. That's taking an axe to them.
Yes. Okay. So my question is just about the relationship between that and essentially, I mean, I realize it sort of sounds like a bit of a pipe dream at the moment to talk about a working class movement for socialism that ultimately transcends or overturns or overthrows capitalism and institutes a transition to socialism and so on. But if that's the long-term goal, I'm wondering about the exact relationship between responding to the financialization of the economy in this way and that long-term goal. And one possibility, which seemed to be hinted at by what you were saying just now, I think, or more than hinted at, was that there's a thought that Marx had, right, that capitalism has to develop to a certain point in order for a transition to socialism to be successful. And so perhaps the thought is that financialization is impeding or preventing that from happening. Another possibility is that you might think that the working class have to be sufficiently economically okay in order to be able to successfully fight for socialism, right? Like they have to be able to strike without worrying that they'll lose their health care. And maybe that's part of why we need to fight against financialization. Or maybe there are other thoughts about it. Or maybe there's something about that whole framing that you don't like. But I'm just curious what you would say about that, if that makes sense.
Well, most revolutions are led from the top, not from the bottom, unfortunately. And I think that it would be a mistake to try to frame your attempt to bring about socialism by limiting it to the working class. I knew almost all of the socialist leaders in Chicago and the rest where I grew up and the rest of the country. There were hardly any working class members among them. It was Marx expected the capitalist class itself to continue to lead the revolution as it had led the revolution against the landlord class ever since the Corn Law debates after 1815. And the whole attempt to tax the land, tax away the hereditary rents of the European aristocracy, the nobility, that was receiving these rents, because Marx said the dynamic of industrial capitalism is to free economies from the faux frais, from the false costs of production, to minimize the costs, to make the economy more competitive. And in that sense, there was a revolution in the 19th century, the revolution to get rid of feudalism. It wasn't led by the working class. It was led by the upper class, and later it was joined by the middle class. I don't see the working class today being very much advocate for socialism. And in Chicago, all of the socialists that I knew were pretty middle class. Obviously, especially those who I knew at the University of Chicago. I doubt that any of you are really working class, but because in order to advocate socialism, you have to explain how all of the different elements of the economy dovetail together, and how the different layers come together, and how if you don't free yourself from the economic rent, not only land rent, but monopoly rent and especially banks, then you're going to be stifled. Well, what Marx expected to happen was that money was going to be made a public utility. It wasn't going to be left in private hands. And there was indeed a discussion of this leading up to the 1890s. Well, in 1913, you had a devastating impact on the American economy, the creation of the Federal Reserve. And the aim of the Federal Reserve was very explicitly to take financial policy out of the hands of the Treasury and put it in the hands of Wall Street. Today, many of the working class people today are for libertarianism. Libertarianism is basically an anti-government policy, and the idea of getting rid of libertarians are central planners. It must be understood at the beginning. They're central planners because if you get rid of government, well, every economy is planned by someone, and if you get rid of government regulation and planning, then all this planning leads to Wall Street. If you get rid of government taxation of real estate, then the land rent, and the monopoly rents for consumers end up being paid to the banks. So whereas the 19th century fought its revolution to get free of the landlord class, today the banking class, the financial sector, is in the same position in the 21st century that landlords were in the 19th century. But you don't see any Western country fighting against that, because everybody takes the existing structure of society for granted. Well, as you know, from the very beginning, socialism was how to change the structure. Almost everybody was a socialist in the last part of the 19th century. The question of being a socialist was, how is capitalism going to evolve? And what will it evolve into? There was Christian socialism, there was libertarian socialism, sort of nutcases like Henry George, there was Marxian socialism, but there was even Catholic socialism. They all had their idea of how capitalism was evolved, because it was obvious that it couldn't continue the way it was. And in fact, industrial capitalism didn't continue the way it was. And in the last century, and especially since the 1980s, what we have today is not industrial capitalism anymore, with the dynamics that Marx described in Capital. It's become finance capitalism with quite different dynamics that are actually anti-industrial and antithetical to the basic dynamics of industrial capitalism. Well, China has, because after Mao's revolution in China, there wasn't any wealthy creditor class to lend money to the government. So obviously the only way you could organize the Chinese economy was to do what every socialist economy should do. It made the government, the treasury, created the money. It didn't need to borrow the money. It just created the money. Same thing happened in Russia. The bank was the distributor of the planner, providing credit, because whoever is control of the credit supply determines the shape in which economies will grow. That's why Marx wrote that what he expected was that banks would somehow evolve into the commanding heights of socialism. And that actually was happening in the Germany of his day, which is why I draw the distinction between the German industrial banking that was very successful and the hit and run short-term Anglo-American and Dutch banking. Marx thought that it was in the interest of the industrial class to get rid of this Anglo-American banking and to do what Germany was doing. And of course, the government should use banking as to distribute income in a way that would be mostly productive. And in America, economists who were trained in Germany all came out here and advocated that basic public utilities, canals, railroads, water and sewer, communications, the radio system, the phone system, should all be government utilities so that they wouldn't be privately owned, so that they wouldn't be privatized. Well, that occurred especially in England as well as Germany. And you all know what's happened since the 1980s. All of Europe's been Thatcherized.
Daniel, you wanted to ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Hi. Thanks for talking to us. So I want to try to sharpen maybe the question to see if I'm understanding this right. So I'm getting the sense you're saying that capitalism as a sort of revolutionary development, which was getting rid of feudalism, was kind of met with a feudal rentier insurrection, which sort of stopped it. It would have if it had gone with the German model, say, industrial capitalism would have transitioned towards socialism, or even, industrial capitalism with democratic leadership is just socialism. But instead, there was a counter-revolution, and we're still living in the sort of ignoragnum period between feudalism and what would have happened, and what we have is kind of financialized feudalism. And so, in a sense, the order of operations is to get rid of the rest of feudalism and, in a sense, go back to capitalism.
Yes, because industrial capitalism has been replaced by, as you said, the reaction, which is finance capitalism, which is in many ways a return. It's been called neo-feudalism, like the discussion that we had a few months ago at Chicago.
Eric.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's a real pleasure. I know we all really enjoyed reading your book and your other works on super imperialism as well, and some of our other courses. One of the topics that came up in our group, one of the questions rather, is how to understand sort of this historical transition, say beginning in the 70s and 80s, from industrial capitalism towards financialization, or what we would think of as neoliberalism, whatever other term might be appropriate. And we came across kind of a couple of different views that seemed to be in conflict. On the one hand, we studied some authors associated with the Monthly Review, particularly Fred Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster, who essentially argue that the transition from industrial capitalism to financial capitalism was because there was a crisis within industrial capitalism around failure to profitably reinvest surplus profits. And so stagnation comes about within industrial capitalism. And because there's a need for some new means of capital accumulation, you see the deregulation of banks and the rise of finance. On the other hand, your book seems to be saying the opposite, rather, that finance strangles industry. And so I wonder if you could comment on how do you, is there like a direct causal relation here that we can posit, or is it more complicated than that between stagnation and finance, and kind of how that transition happened?
The question is, how did all this surplus money become available? Almost all the fortunes in history have been made financially, or they've been made by taking the public domain into private hands. Privatization. I mean, think of in Russia after 1991, the kleptocrats. Kleptocracy is the basic dynamic of finance capitalism. So it's not the problem with Foster's view and the whole background there is the assumption or the failure to realize that banks create new money. They create credit. All this money that's spilled into finance was created on the bank by the bank itself on their balance sheet. If you go into a bank and you want a loan, you don't. The banker doesn't say, "Let me see how much money I have," and to lend you. He said, "Okay, we'll make you the loan. You sign a IOU." Debt note. The banker puts money in your checking account. You owe him the money. That's just a fresh creation of money. That's the difference between a commercial bank that creates credit and a savings bank that can't do that. A savings bank can only lend out money that's already deposited. Foster and almost the entire so-called Marxist community do not understand banking. They believe this the loanable funds theory, that the economies only can can lend money that somebody's already saved. Well, who wants to promote that idiotic theory? People who've saved a lot of money and don't want the banks, don't want people to understand that the banks can create money just whatever they want. Because if you realize that the banks can create money just out of nothing but a balance sheet, then you realize the government can do it. Why shouldn't the government create the money? Why should the banks create money when they don't create it to be part of the production process? Banks don't make loans for production. They don't make loans to build factories. They make loans to corporate raiders to take over factories, fire the workers, downsize, and squeeze it out, smash up the company, and to sell off the company's real estate amount of money, agree on a lease back, and pay the sales price to the financial backers as a special dividend. The attempt to make an idea of how the economy works without realizing that it's the bankers that do the planning, it's the bankers that create the money, the bankers that create the economic surplus, then you're just going to somehow imagine that capitalism itself creates this money to monopolize. And if capitalism didn't do that, it was the financial class independently of capitalism that created this money to take over the industry, to take over the means of production, and then just smash it up for themselves. I think this group today is probably the first Marxist group I've spoken to in the last 30 years. I don't know any Marxist who's interested in finance at all. I think before IRPI, a few years ago, maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago, had someone, I think some Mr. Mason, who'd tried to study Marxism in Amherst, said, well, finance, there isn't any such thing as finance capitalism is different from industrial capitalism. Last Saturday, I sat down with Richard Wolff, and we had a 4-hour discussion with Robinson Earhart on the evolution of Marxism and how was it that Marxists have turned so anti-Marxism. What makes Marxism Marxists hate Volume 2 so much, hate Volume 3 so much? Why do they not understand the role of banking? There's I think personalities of very ignorant people such as you're describing, who have this tunnel vision that is they've been suckered by the banking class and the lobbyists.
So just to clarify, you're saying that Marxists wrongly think that banks are intermediaries that lend deposits rather than creating deposits? That's
exactly right. So I don't think they're Marxists. Most people that claim to be Marxists aren't. And I must say, I've had the same problem in China very often. I won't get into the details, but most of the China, my students in China tells me that the students that are sent to America to study economics still get priority in being hired over graduates where I was a professor at the School of Marxist Studies in Beijing, PKU. It's a fight that is even going on in China right now, which is what led to China to permit this whole bank financed real estate bubble that is now collapsing.
Did you have a question related to that, Daniel?
Yeah. So just to sharpen your comment even more. So basically, the mistake with the monthly review monopoly capital view, the mistake with that school is that so finance is not excess profits because banks aren't lending deposited profits. They're creating money.
Yes, and I think Harry Magdoff and I were friendly. He could understand that. His job was selling insurance, but Sweezy I could see he felt quite hostile for all of this, and I never became very friendly with them. Only with Magdoff, and you put your finger on it exactly.
Sam.
Hi, Professor Hudson. Thanks for coming to talk to us. In your introduction, you described an ideological war against Marxist economic analysis. One of the first texts we read in the 2008 financial crisis course was your essay, The Archology of Money, in which you described two conflicting theories of the origin of money, one in which it functions effectively as a convenience.
Wait, whose book, Archology of Money?
Your essay?
Oh, you read that? Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't realize I'd circulated that already. It's still in press. The University of Chicago is supposed to distribute it. I don't know whether they're going to do a good job of it, but okay, continue. Now I know.
I got nervous. I got the author wrong. That would have been
yeah.
Anyway, so two theories of the origin of money.
Shirts.
One in which it functions effectively as a convenience to enable barter,
Yeah.
and another in which money is fundamentally financial, enabling
Yeah.
Charging interest and so on.
Right.
I interpreted the former theory as being motivated by this war that you described in your introduction against Marxist economic analysis. Can you describe any other financial myths that have been created by this conflict?
Yes, and I just published the sort of collection of my my academic essays, Temples of Enterprise, and I described the origins of money, that it wasn't barter. Money was created to pay taxes, and land tenure was created to pay taxes to the temples and the palaces. Basically, it didn't have anything to do with barter, because the whole idea of that economies are barter is non-historical. Money was only used from the Bronze Age all the way down to maybe the 14th century in England. The cultivators on the land would use money once a year at harvest time. When the harvest was in, they would pay by turning over their grain. They would on the threshing floor in Babylonia, and that would be weighed, and then they would pay all of the credit that they'd run up during the other year. For the rest of the year. For instance, if they went to an ale house, the ale woman would put the beer on literally on the tab. And we have examples of that. And at the end of when the harvest was in and the grain was being measured out on the threshing floor, the ale lady would be paid. Priests would be paid if they provided service, marriage services or debt services or whatever. Everybody would. That's when the money came into being. Just for that exchange. And similarly, in the medieval time, all of the serfs or the peasants would build up debt during the year. The harvest would be in. They'd pay it all. They wouldn't really be given silver coins and pay. Everything would be sort of monetized at the monetary equivalent, and the debts would be settled. So the idea of looking at an economy as if there was no debt, as if there was no credit, that means that you don't say, well, who owed the money to whom? And who were the creditors? And how did debtors get into such trouble? This was the Austrian approach to everything. And they didn't want any discussion of who the creditors were, because originally almost all societies wanted to prevent creditors from getting enough power from labor, from other people, to end up overthrowing the king and taking a creditor-oriented Margaret Thatcher, Milton Friedman society instead. And in the Heinrich Schirz's book that you mentioned, he pointed out that, well, the source of instability in these indigenous communities, it wasn't really money yet. It was a form of wealth that we call, it was a sort of proto-money wealth. Most of it came from dealings with foreigners, dealing abroad. They were shells that you didn't get at home, or something else you didn't get at home, or an heirloom of some prestigious family, some clothes that somebody had worn. And he said the whole problem is money tended to be destabilizing. Well, how does primitive society, not primitive, I don't like that word, indigenous societies deal with it? Well, if somebody had accumulated wealth and gold, not gold, or whatever wealth was, that would be buried with them instead of being bequeathed to their children. And the whole idea of archaic societies was you don't want hereditary wealth to begin to build up and make some families more powerful than others, or else you get the Rockefellers. And they use their wealth to essentially gain control of the government, and they favor their kids. And the problem is that every generation that inherits wealth, the IQ goes down 10%, then another 10% in the next generation. I mean, I'm sure you've all met people who've inherited the money, and you notice that something's dulling their their mind. Well, ancient society wanted to prevent that stupefying effect of wealth.
Jonathan?
Hello, Dr. Hudson. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you for talking with us. I know I've been a big fan of yours since hearing about you on nakedcapitalism.com. So always enjoy your work and your talks, and you're very
Thank you.
you speak you're like a Marxist for the layman, and you speak very simply, and it's like something that I'm not from an economic or math kind of background, but the way that you put things is very logical and reasonable, and the way that you kind of fit in all these ancient figures from history, like the Gracchi brothers or Jesus, and just like kind of how they kind of fit into today's kind of economics or our society. It's been very good, especially for me. So I guess my kind of question is if you could comment on kind of how the funding our military industrial complex right now, how we're basically giving them billions of dollars. And it seems like they're using that money to build, I guess, weapons of war. And how, if I'm remembering you correctly, empires, they suck the wealth from their hinterlands, to their city, and then they kind of use that wealth to kind of buy out all the poor people around them, and kind of turn them into serfs and buy up other land and everything. So could you just kind of comment on if that's happening, or am I even kind of close?
Well, it's not the military-industrial complex. It's really the bankers. You can take a look at the junk mortgage loans that were leading up to 2008. And the fact is that the loans were made of the carrying charges on the mortgage for the loans were much higher than the rents would have been. But people were frightened into buying houses because they thought if they didn't, then rents would continue to go up. Well, then, President Obama, or before he was president, when he was running for office, promised to write down the loans to the actual market price. There were fake fraudulent market prices and appraisals done by crooked appraisers. There were fraudulent statements of income made by the brokers to fill out the papers for the mortgage borrowers, and all of these. This was really the big lever. So it wasn't that you just buy out. Nobody wanted to buy out the problems of the poor people, the low-income people. What they wanted to do was foreclose on. They wanted to throw them out. They wanted to just throw them out of the house and all of a sudden crash real estate prices. So companies like Blackstone and other big corporate landlords could come in and buy them all out. That's who Obama was working for, the landlords. Are most of you from Chicago? Here?
There's a couple of us from Chicago. Most of us are from all over the nation.
Louisiana.
What Obama did in Chicago as an example for this?
Sure, go ahead.
You want me to? You're raising your hand. Does that mean yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I knew Obama's teachers at Harvard, at the law school. I gave lectures at the law school. I was associated with Harvard for 25 years in the archaeology department, which is the only place where I could, the only department that talked about debt was the archaeology department. So I knew Obama's teachers, and one of his black teachers came up to me and said, I was we never got along with Obama. When he left, he decided to be a community leader. He said, now, Obama was one of the editors of the Law Journal, and very prestigious. Most law students who had that job would become a clerk for a Supreme Court justice. But Obama didn't do that, didn't go that route. He wanted to be a community leader. And what does a community leader do? Yeah, well, the community leader works with the real estate reverends and the big real estate families, and essentially he clears out the community. Obama worked with the Pritzker family, the family of Pritzker, who's now your governor of Illinois, and the Crown family. And his job was the University of Chicago was the big blockbuster when I grew up. I'll get to that later. But the University of Chicago and real estate reverends and basically the Pritzkers and Crowns began to buy real estate in the black neighborhoods on the southwest side. And Obama came in and arranged for them all to be torn down. And then that they were very well located because they were along the subway. And that's what made billionaires for the Pritzkers. The University of Chicago was doing this back in the 1950s when I lived in Hyde Park. I was at 48th and Dorchester. And one day, a black family moved into our block down the street. And found out, worked hard to get the loan. My sister was friends with the daughter of the family. So, I talked over to get the loan. Well, it turned out they bought it from the brokers who were the University of Chicago brokers. Well, as soon as the black family moved in, the whites began to panic and began to sell out on the street. So you had other brokers come in, buy the houses inexpensively, and then sell them at a huge price markup to other black families who are finally, they said, finally we can get a mortgage. Finally, banks will lend to us. And the blacks bought into Dorchester and Blackstone on the east side and began to buy them. And then once they'd bought in, Mayor Daley came in and condemned the whole block, said we've got to rezone it. They tore down the block with my house in it. My father moved to Hyde Park Boulevard in a nice condo there, and so it was a whole. The real estate speculators made a killing on that, and essentially that was must have been around 1959, 60. Well, essentially, Obama did the same thing on a vaster scale for the university and for the Pritzkers. And that's when they realized, here's a great guy. He can tear down the black neighborhoods and still get the black vote. This is the guy, he's such a, so thoroughly corrupt and smooth, he's the guy we want to push as president. At any rate, that's and Bob Fitch, who grew up in Chicago too, wrote a big expose of that. I think it's on the Naked Capitalism site somewhere from years ago, where I published it right after Bob died.
I wanted to ask a question about local politics because the sense that we got from your book, and I think from your comments just a minute ago, is that the only way to fight back against financial capitalism is through the state, which controls money.
And
The hard part about
for the workers to do it. Yes, to fight. Who's going to fight against the state? It has to be well positioned people. It's usually the upper class. And who were the old socialists of the 19th century? Certainly, when I was growing up, my father was a union leader and went to jail as one of the Minneapolis 17. So I grew up with union leaders. Most of them were middle class people, except truck drivers.
Right. The trouble with fighting back at least at the federal level, which is where the money making happens, is you would probably need the presidency and or the House of Representatives and the Senate, and very difficult to take control of that. And so the temptation for other people wanting to fight back somehow politically is to go back to the local level where elections might be easier. There's less power, but maybe there's something that can actually be done. What do you think about that avenue for fighting
It's
against?
very appealing in principle, because it's the only place that you can make a movement. It worked in Minneapolis in the 1930s. Minneapolis was, apart from being the only Trotskyist city in the world, it was the whole leadership that put together the truckers, the Teamsters Union. Yes, it can work in some cases there, but usually it ends up being sort of absorbed. Max Shachtman gave a speech once and said, you know, what happened? Yeah, I think in around 1962, he gave a wonderful speech. What happened to all the old socialists? You know, his generation.
Right.
He said they ended up all going out west and making nice socialist communities, and then their kids all became artisans in the communities because they were socialists. The communities were very creative, became art centers, and all the children became.
So what do you think would be the most practical intervention at the local level, the most likely to succeed and the most likely to actually help the working class people of a given?
It really all depends on the circumstance. But as Lenin said, there has to be a revolutionary situation. And right now, when you say, well, how on earth can you ever expect the wealthy classes to overthrow the existing economic system? Well, the times they all do it is when there is a social collapse. That's how the Russian Revolution took place. That's how the Chinese Revolution took place. There almost has to be a clash because the vested interests make such a consolidated power amongst themselves that you saw what happened to Bernie Sanders and his supporters within the Democratic Party. They all got co-opted because they realized all we can do is a marginal level. Well, and at a local level, all you can do is being marginal. You can try to change the tax the absentee-owned real estate. You can try to tax the land value instead of the wealthy value. You can do local tax shifts and make an economy better, but it's really all about taxes and finance. You can have like the Bank of South Dakota that a lot of local developers want. Well, that's good in principle, but they can't really create enough credit, and the Federal Reserve is never going to extend them the credit that predatory banks get. So that's part of the whole problem there. You have the whole establishment against you as long as the system's working. So I have not been able to do anything. I thought, you know, what can I do to change the situation? Well, all I can do is write about history and show people how to think, why the system is going to tear itself apart. That's the only thing that I can think of. There's no way that I can react at a local level, especially in a city like New York that's so utterly corrupt.
The other thought that we had reading your book, at least I did, was that class war is sometimes waged in the stock market with, you know, activist takeovers of productive companies to financialize them. So one very broad and sort of, you know, speculative question I have is there a way possibly to wage class war in the stock market on behalf of working people or on behalf of you know, the people more broadly? And we've seen sort of some attempts at this, you know, in history with Saul Alinsky and his struggle against Kodak. I thought maybe, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the GameStop incident recently. Also, you know, can see various ways I could imagine. I mean, one way I could think of is there a way to defend against these activist attacks that you mentioned in your book, or is there another more productive route to, you know, take the stock market as the arena of class struggle to try to wage it on behalf of ordinary people?
Well, you're going to have Harris, if she wins, or certainly Trump, get rid of Lena, of the anti-monopolist regulator, and sort of turn over everything to the corporate raiders. So it's very hard to work on, with the stock market itself. One way that I tried and failed was to get the Black community as the main activist community, and the issue for that would be largely on real estate. There's been a race war in America that ever since the slavery time. The race war came to a peak actually in 1945. And that's when it was decided to make sure that Black families could not get mortgages. Banks would only lend to white families, unless, of course, it was the University of Chicago trying to crash real estate and pick up something cheap and tear it down. Well, right today, you have a huge disparity between the Blacks and the white population. And what's this? Where did all this? There's discussion about reparations. And I'd like to shift the terms of the reparations debate. And this has overall economic discussions. Yeah, it's very hard to pay reparations for somebody who was enslaved 150 years ago. That's really not the problem. The problem is to pay reparations to Blacks who are suffering today from what has been built in to the economy by the fact that the white middle-class families after World War I, the way to join the middle class for all these soldiers coming back from the war was to be able to buy a house. And you could buy a house you could go to the bank, get a loan, and as long as they would lend you a mortgage to buy the house, only up to 25% of the income you had, not 43% today. Now, the white families were all able to get their own houses on the easy mortgage credit and the VA loans after World War II. But the Blacks were prevented from this. Well, what that has done is create a two-tiered society. If the badge of being a member of the middle class is owning your house, but almost all of the houses of white people, not mine, I had to buy my own, but almost white people have houses that the parents bequeathed to their children, and then their children bequeathed to their children. They were already all able to get mortgages for the house at an affordable rate that was only 25% of their income until remember the 1990s. Well, that explains why the Black population doesn't have housing today. And without housing, they're prone to all of this rent pressures. Well, they've been disenfranchised from membership in the middle class by the current situation of inherited wealth for the whites. The only solution, you're obviously not going to be able to take the houses away, is for the governments to create a huge real public housing, not the kind of housing you had to tear down in Chicago, which was white anti-Black housing, but actual housing just as nice as white people's housing, houses that you can actually live in. That would call into question the whole issue of real estate, how real estate pricing has been all a product of however much banks would lend, and the whole price inflation that it's this asset price inflation that's been financialized that has created this racial disparity in the United States. I think that would open up the financial and the real estate and the rentier awareness that I'm trying to bring about. And obviously, you can't just give free new housing to Black people. You'd have to give it to everybody to make it viable to other poor people. So poor Hispanics, poor poor people in general. You would have to use this black reparations solution as an economy-wide solution. And I can't think of any better way of letting people viscerally understand the class war and how
it seems that it seems that at least it's in the air in American politics that if you are a political ally or advocate of poor or working class people or black people, you should really support the Democratic Party. You should really, turn out the vote.
Democrats,
Turn out the vote for the Democratic Party.
The most racist. Just look at Obama. Just in my book, I describe exactly what Obama did. That's why he was pushed by people. Quite frankly, I know some of the fun. I better not even mention. I use language that I think people wouldn't like. But Obama was somebody had suggested that the only way that you can get better laws for the blacks is to take away the right of black people to vote, because they're the people who are willing to vote for the most anti-black leaders, like the congressional leader. I'm blocking out his name right now, who went and through the election to Obama. So he understands us. You know who I mean, the Democratic House.
Right.
And the Black Caucus in Congress is known for being the utterly corrupt opportunists there by other people, and they get their money by delivering their constituency to their donors and protectors. So the black population is tricked into thinking if there's a black politician, he's on our side. They don't get it that white people have caught on to this and figured out how to game the system.
Last event we had a Walter Ben Michaels, who we greatly admire and respect for his writings on class politics and identity politics, who seem to be, advocating for the position that at least of the two parties, you're going to get either a Republican or a Democrat, and if you had to choose between the two, you have to go with the Democratic Party, and that's not a unique position to him. That's it's an argument that we've encountered over and over and over again on the left and in these discussions. And I know you yourself, a professor, are with the Green Party, and you're supporting Jill Stein's presidency.
I'm her political economic advisor.
Oh, right.
Yes,
right.
I mean, we're working together. And she and I have said on numerous times, we've had two shows on Neiman's site. We're very clear that there cannot be any progress made in American politics without getting rid of the Democratic Party, period. Awful as it may seem to get the Democrats out of power, even at the cost of turning it over to Trump and the Republicans, who will certainly self-destruct the economy very quickly. If you want to destruct the economy, do that. But as long as you have the blacks pretending to be the protectors of the minorities, protectors of the poor, protectors of everybody who's not a Republican, when actually what they're doing is their job is to protect the Republicans and the vested interests from any critique from the left. And you want to take away the ability of that pretense that the Democrats represent the left. So Jill and I have both said one of our aims, we know that she's not going to be elected president, but we can make sure that the Democratic Party will not get the presidency and can never get the presidency again, because we're going to make it very clear to the voters how it's necessary to destroy the Democratic Party and the Democratic Leadership Committee and the whole rotten structure of it in order for them to be any free electoral progress in the United States.
So the purpose is to make Kamala Harris lose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what you get.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
We have a couple questions left. One is on the um, question of international relations with Mearsheimer. Daniel, did you want to ask that?
Sure. So I have a question. It's not exactly right on the topic of killing the host, but it's related. You give a very clear picture in your book that basically, as it is now, government, people with executive power and government positions are sort of asset managers for the absentee owning rentier types to make sure that they get their return on their investment, however they have to, predation or whatever it means. And I was just wondering, because I follow quite closely what John Mearsheimer says and what you say as well about the international relations with China, with Russia, Ukraine. And I was just wondering, so what you think about Mearsheimer's realist view, which I am quite sympathetic to in general, but so he says that all states are like black boxes. They're like billiard balls. You don't look inside of them. We assume that any state would behave this way of trying to take as much power as possible. Any state in this position would try to take as much power as possible, and that's realism, because the international order is anarchic and conflict is what settles it. I mean, which is a realistic description. But my sense is, and I think this might be your sense too from reading your book, you have to look inside the states. You have to disaggregate those units, and you have to, because different leaderships of different states have different interests, different motivations, and different needs. I get the sense from reading your book that the leadership of this country needs certain things from the international order, which are different from, for instance, what the leadership of China or Russia would need. Lindsey Graham goes on the news and says there's $9 to $12 trillion of rare earth minerals under Ukraine. So when I hear that, I think, okay, this government is not a black box. It's the asset manager in chief for the asset owners. And I just want to hear what you think maybe about Mearsheimer's view, because I'm sympathetic to realism, but I feel like what you have to say could complement that.
He's too philosophical. Here's the problem. All of my colleagues try to take a materialist approach to history, and we begin the first idea. And I stopped calling myself an economist in the 1970s because I wasn't saying what economists were saying. I called myself a futurist. So I was working with Alvin Toffler, Herman Kahn, others. How do you project the future? Well, you assume that everybody's going to act in their self-interest. Well, here's the problem. Is America today acting in its self-interest? Well, as you just said, there are different layers. It's in somebody's self-interest, but it's not in America's self-interest. It's in the particular group that is running the government. I think Stalin made the big mistake in World War II in not thinking Germany was going to attack Russia. And what was his logic? He said, well, Germany would have to be crazy to attack Russia. Its interest is not attacking Russia. Let it come. And yet Germany acted against its self-interest because it was run by crazy Hitler, who really should never have, the army should never have let him set the military policy. Well, you have another crazy person today in America. You have Biden, who's done the war in, he's a crazy Russian hater, and he's surrounded himself with Russia haters. I did a show with Nima a week ago, and then again yesterday, going over how the Russia haters were cultivated by the neocons, and basically it all came out of Scoop Jackson and the right-wing military industrial complex. Jackson it was the Democratic Party leader in 1960. They called him the senator from Boeing because he was from Boeing State, and he brought in all of the neocons. And I actually heard some of the negotiations going on where all of this happened. I discussed this on Namath's show. It's too long to go into here. But obviously, what America is doing right now in Ukraine, in the Near East, is you can't say that acting in a crazy way is in the self-interest of the country. You have most of the voters in America realizing they don't want war in Ukraine or in Israel or in Iran, and yet the government pays no attention to them at all. Same thing in Europe. The voters are completely against the Ukrainian war, but the European Commission is sort of non-elected, but in the hands of von der Leyen, and who appoints Russia haters. And so you have the situation from Europe to the United States, where you have a particular clique taking over that military and is self-destructive. Well, how can, if you're trying to forecast history and explain international affairs and how people will act, how can you explain how a country will act self-destructively? There are a million ways you can do. All you can do is say, here's the logical way that a self-interest would be expressed. And in the past, that worked. It doesn't work in today's world. But you can analyze it by looking at who the nutcases are and where they come and how they get their support.
Sorry, Daniel, did you have a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, so please, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, so is it really as simple as that the people in charge hate Russia? Or, I mean, if you look, there's plenty of people who are benefiting from the war in Ukraine against Russia. So I guess the question is, are there other interests at play here?
Interest besides what?
Besides hating Russia and being gratified by Russia losing its citizens in war?
Well, I think it's pretty clear what Russia's Lavrov and Putin explain very clearly what their logic is, and they follow it very clearly because they're both trying to follow the logic of law, rule of law very clearly. So it's easy to say what Russia's interest is going to be. It's pretty easy to see what China's interest is going to be. It's almost impossible to explain what German interest is going to be, because that really requires not European. It really requires the government to be not only the government to be voted out of office in Germany and Europe, but the whole Eurozone from being dismantled. I mean, if we're talking about where if the source of chaos in the world is the United States now, then breaking away Europe it will at least end that colonialized chaos. I think what Putin is doing is going very slow, and he's not in a hurry to settle the Ukrainian war, because he realizes that the longer it goes on, the more the pressure is building up in Europe, just to say the Eurozone isn't working. European politics don't work. It's all part of NATO. Europe basically is run by NATO. Out of a small basement in the Pentagon or the CIA, you could joke. It's not run by the people. Well, right now, you're having the nationalist parties opposing the war. That's the irony. It's the so-called left-wing parties, the social democratic parties, and the labor parties that are on the pro-war parties now, the anti-labor parties. It's like all of the left-wing movements in Europe have been Tony Blairized. What do you do about that? Well, that's what's opened the gates to the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the right wing in France, the right wing in Italy. I don't think this could have been predicted 20 years ago, certainly not when I was in school.
So I was asking specifically about other interests in the United States and in the West in general. I think Daniel put a question in the chat that succinctly summarizes the question, which I'll read. What is the difference between the interests/motives of the USA on the one hand and Russia or China on the other?
Wait, so what's the point again?
What is the difference between the interests or motives of the United States on the one hand and Russia or
The
China?
United States wants to control, to essentially let American banks into China and Russia, and to take over the loans and to take over Russia's raw materials and public utilities. They want to restore the Yeltsin era. They want foreigners. Remember, Russia was the biggest stock market in the world, 1965 to 1995 to 1996, because you had everything being privatized and taken over. The United States wants another Yeltsin who will be willing to turn over ownership of Russia's rent-yielding real estate, natural resources, and monopolies to American buyers, so that the economic surplus of Russia will be transferred to the United States. And the US planners realize, well, to do that, we're going to have to carve up Russia into 5 different countries and find the most corrupt leader in every country who will sell off their resources and have sort of a parody of what Trotsky called a permanent revolution. It'll be the permanent counter-revolution. They want to break up China into its part, so that they say, instead of the Bank of China making loans to industry, want American banks to go over there, send Robert Rubin back there, and the bankers will get all of the revenue from the Chinese companies instead of, and they'll use if they take over the high technology companies, they'll pay out the dividends as stock. They'll pay out the profits as stock, buybacks or as dividends, instead of reinvesting, and they'll sort of just grind China down in order to empty it out as quickly as they can. That's the American interest. The Chinese and Russian interest is to prevent this and to keep to prevent the rent-yielding monopolies, natural resources, and land from being and banking from being monopolized, to keep it in public hands. That's their version of socialism, and that's the key to any socialist economy.
Hey, Dr. Hudson. I just wanted to ask you, in your futurist, best Marxist, kind of prognostication, would you say that Russia and China, with the BRICS group that they're building, do you see a path for them to kind of keep the pressure up on, the American government and the American state to kind of turn over the financial warmongers, or are we just fucked?
No, they're not putting they want nothing to do with the United States. They want to break off. We're seeing a whole split in the world. Literally, this is a civilizational split. The global majority just wants to be independent of the United States and Europe. They want to go their own way. They have no interest in influencing the US. All they want to do is say, get away from us. If you don't remove your military bases, we're going to bomb them. You go your way, we'll go ours. They want to just go their own way. They don't want relations with the United States and its puppets or colonies or satellites, whatever you call them. They're trying to reinvent the wheel. I wish they were more familiar with the wheel was already developed in the 19th century. And I think they're trying to reinvent it without looking at classical economics and even without looking for Marx. When I was appointed as a professor at the School of Marxist Studies, Sasha Bozgalin, who and his wife was also appointed a professor at the same day of economics, told me that Marxism was the Chinese word for politics. And I think that explained it all to me. Now I got it.
Yeah,
Now how to interpret what they're doing.
We're coming to a close, and we want to respect your time, Professor. So if I could ask just for a closing statement. We've talked a lot about the financial crisis and contemporary politics. What do you think the long-standing impact is of these events, and what do you think the future holds for us?
Well, maybe there won't be a long term. Maybe we don't know whether Biden is really going to give in to the neocons and bomb Iran, in which case Iran will destroy Israel. The Democrats are dead set in conquering the entire Near East and essentially controlling the world's oil supply, and oil is the key to energy, to energy use per worker, for lighting, for fuel. The whole center of American foreign policy is on oil. And it's willing to go to war for this. They are crazy people. I've met them. I know them. They're filled with hatred. And most of all, we're seeing a fight against civilization. When you have America, there's one common denominator between America, Ukraine, and Israel. They all say that other people who are not part of our group are subhuman. That is what the Ukrainians have said. We're going to kill the Slavs, the Russians, because they're a different species. We've evolved into a new species. It's called American democracy. And other people are not in the species. We have to literally exterminate them. These are the words they're using. They're Nazis. Same thing in Netanyahu's speeches. These people are subhuman. That's the word. Now, if you have any group that claims that another group is subhuman, this is a fight against civilization. The only thing that civilization can do, and this is what China, Russia, and the global majority realize, all you can do is shun them, isolate them, have nothing to do with them. I don't know how they're going to get rid of the problem in Israel without just bombing the whole country. Same thing with Ukraine, which is being pretty much self-descriptive. But you have the fight of World War II is now being refought with America on the Nazi side, and treating America and its allies as a new species that has to exterminate the other species that are not joining the American orbit, as if they're a danger to their human species, with everyone else being subhuman. This is the kind of racism that goes way beyond what I think anybody had thought about in the kind of identity politics that you have here. But this is exactly what's being fought. Again, I think I did this I said these same things on Nima show, on the Dialogue Works yesterday. Does that sound radical to you?
Does that what?
Sound too radical?
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for coming, Professor. It's been a great discussion. Yeah, we did not run out of questions, to say the least. So we hope we can have you on back sometime
Well,
in
I'm
the
glad we
future.
got to meet each other. And if you do transcribe it, then it can be circulated, and maybe we can get a larger group. We've got to keep expanding these ideas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.